So, for those of you tuning in, thank you for stopping by. We are going to be talking about YA fantasy novels that we love. And so I am Amanda. I'm going to be moderating today, and I have Tanaz Bhathena and Melissa De La Cruz here to talk about their novels. Ladies, would you like to introduce yourselves and tell our fans a little bit about who you are?
Sure. Do you want to go first, Melissa?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm Tanaz Bhathena, and I'm an author. I've written a couple of contemporary novels, A Girl Like That and Beauty of the Moment, and my most recent novel has been a YA fantasy called Hunted by the Sky. This is the first of a YA fantasy duology set in a world inspired by medieval India. The story follows a girl named Gul who's been prophesied to be the downfall of a tyrant king. When Gul's parents are murdered by the king's soldiers, she's taken in by a group of rebel women called the Sisterhood of Golden Lotus, who train her in warrior magic. And by the time she's 16, she wants only one thing, and that is revenge. So she basically manages to infiltrate the king's palace with the help of a reluctant stable boy named Kavas, who has some dark secrets of his own. But what Gul and Kavas don't realize is that the palace has its own secrets, and the bond between them is stronger than just a romance. And this book follows their journey in Rising Like a Storm, which is the finale, the second book of this duology, and it comes out on June 22nd of this year.
I'm Melissa De La Cruz, and I'm the author of many books for kids, teens, and adults. I wrote the Disney Descendants series, the Blue Blood series, Alex and Eliza, Witches of East End. And my latest books are a middle grade fantasy called Never After. And I'm here for my Queen's Secret duology. The sequel, The Queen's Secret, just came out, and the first book is The Queen's Assassin.
Awesome. And those are the books we get to talk about today. So I am so excited. Okay, first things first, I just wanted to kind of get to know you guys a little bit better. So I wanted to see, why fantasy? Where did your love for fantasy begin? How did that kind of lend into your writing careers? Melissa, do you mind going first and kind of telling us about where your life with fantasy began?
Sure. I was a huge fantasy reader as a teen. And I think I really started kind of loving fantasy with The Lord of the Rings. So I read that when I was 12, and I wanted to name my children Legolas and Arwen. I was a big Lord of the Rings geek. Sadly, my kid is not named Arwen. Sorry. But yeah, it was my favorite. I think when you're a reader, or at least, a fantasy reader, once you get one, you can't stop. And that's, how I really love the genre. I think it was my favorite genre. I was very escapist. I would rather read a fantasy novel than any other kind of book. I love Dune. That was also a book that I read when I was 13. And then from there, my love of fantasy just, kind of escalated. And I was a mom when Harry Potter came out. So when the 7th book came out, I think my daughter was just born. So I remember sending my husband to the bookstore, at midnight to get the last copy, and I was very, very excited for that.
Awesome. Tanaz, what about you? What was your kind of introduction to fantasy, and what does that look like for you?
For me, I loved fantasy as a child. I remember devouring stories about werewolves, witches, and vampires. R.L. Stine was a particular favorite of mine. I think I used to totally devour his Goosebumps and Fear Street sagas and all that. I was also, so I was an Indian kid growing up in Saudi Arabia. So I also watched a lot of Indian TV shows based on mythology and history, like Ramayana and Akbar Birbal. So these were the kinds of things that I really was exposed to growing up. But I did not read really hardcore fantasy books until I came to Canada. as a teenager, and then I started reading a lot more fantasy and things like that.
Awesome. So how did you guys kind of get into writing? Obviously, you guys are both voracious readers. So how did that kind of translate into a writing career for you? Tanaz, why don't you start for us?
Yeah. So I was an avid reader as a child, and my school also encouraged reading and writing with competitions and things like that. We had this annual magazine at school where kids could submit poetry and stories and stuff like that. And, you know, if you got published, it was like a big deal in the class. So it was like everyone just wanted to see their name in print. So I was that kid. I wanted to see my name in print, and that's how I started, you know, getting into writing. But it's just in general, I just wanted to write stories. I remember when I was 8 years old, I started writing my first ever story. It was about three girls who went to see a witch at on a mountain. Nobody knows what happened to them because I never finished that story. But that's how my journey into writing began. And then I did a lot of like imitation work. Like I'd read my favorite authors and I'd do imitation stories of them, like R.L. Stein. I'd write a story about a werewolf at a girls' boarding school because I was totally into Fear Street, or I'd read a lot of Sweet Valley High back in the day. And then I'd write something about kids in high school and things like that. So that was my introduction.
Awesome. Melissa, what about you? How did you kind of get started writing?
Yeah, I mean, like Tanaz, you know, I remember being 8 years old and writing a book of poems that my mom still has to this day. And I think, you know, once I discovered reading, I really wanted to do the same thing. I wanted to write. So reading and writing kind of came together for me. And it was the thing that I always wanted to do, that I always loved doing. I was always the kid with a book, you know, at a party who would rather read than socialize. And it was always something that I did. I wrote short stories all through middle school and high school. I was the head of the newspaper, the head of the yearbook, and I was in all the creative writing classes in college. And I always wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know how that would happen. You know, how does one become a writer as a profession? So I started out as a journalist, and I was a writer for a lot of New York magazines and newspapers, but I always wanted to write books. That was always my dream. And starting from the age of 22, I would send my proposal for my novel to all these agents. And finally, I think when I was 20, I think 5 years later, 27, I sold my first novel. So I've been in the business now for almost 25 years, I would say. So I've written over 60 books. I've lost count.
Wow, that's incredible. Both of you guys, that's amazing. To just kind of see reading and writing go together. I know just how important those two really are. So why young adult? Why YA? Obviously, Melissa, you've written a lot of books. You mentioned about 60. Are they all YA? How did you kind of get into this kind of niche field?
You know, it's funny because I started out in adult. My first novel was for grown-ups. And my editor, you know, at Simon Schuster said, you know, we think your voice might lend itself well to this new genre that's kind of popping up. Have you read Gossip Girl and Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants? And I said, yes, I love those books. So it wasn't really my idea to kind of fall into YA. It was suggested to me. And I started writing my first YA book called The Au Pairs. And I remember I was on book tour for a nonfiction book that we had just published. And I was on the plane, I was writing The Au Pairs, and I was cackling. And I remember thinking, oh, I'm really good at this. This is really fun. And so I kind of fell into it, but they were right. You know, I really enjoyed writing for teenagers. And I tell teens when I go visit them and do school visits that I write for teens because, you know, at 16 and 17, that guy with the motorcycle and the bad attitude is so hot, but at 35, he's just a loser. So I like to write about, you know, first times and all the idealism and optimism that comes with that age.
Awesome. I love that. Tanaz, what about you? Why YA?
Well, like Melissa, I sort of fell into YA by accident. My first book that I was writing initially started off as a short story collection that my agent tried to sell. We couldn't sell it. People said, write a novel. So I spent a year and a half rewriting the whole thing and wrote a whole novel from scratch. And again, we started trying to sell it to adult publishers. Again, no bites. And then my agent said, you know what, you have a lot of teen characters in this book. Let's try out the YA market, and tried a couple of YA publishers. And one publisher really liked it. The editor talked to me and she said, what if you try to rewrite this as a teen novel? And I said, will it work? She said, yeah, you just need to rewrite the adult voices into YA. And I said, okay, I'll give it a try. And that's how I ended up in YA. And the one thing that I really enjoy is the voice that I get to write in. It's so much fun to just write from that perspective. And also because teen readers are just awesome. You get to meet them whenever, pre-pandemic, they would ask such intelligent questions. Even now, they ask such amazing questions. I'm doing little classroom visits sometimes on Zoom and things like that, and they ask amazing questions. So I totally enjoy this.
Awesome. Do you guys feel like it's easier now that you guys have had so much more experience? Do you feel like it's easier to write adult characters or more of like the teen characters?
I think the teen voice comes very naturally to me because I really resisted growing up and maturity. So, I do like to write teens. I think adults are fun, but not as much fun, I have to say.
Fair enough. Awesome. Yeah. You guys both had very strong characters in both of these books. The female lead was just so spunky and yet sassy, but understood like that there was so much more expected of her. And I loved that was kind of represented in both of your novels, but in such different ways. So I would love to kind of dive into the books a little bit more. And for those of you watching, you guys can get them at Nowhere Bookshop. And they have an online link, so you guys can definitely check them out. These are both duets. Bhathena, Miss Bhathena, you said Hunted by the Sky was also a duet, right? A duology?
Yes, duology, okay. Yeah.
Good. So they're going to both be duologies, which I love. So The Queen's Secret is book 2 to The Queen's Assassin. So Melissa, this is I read both of them. It was such a great duo of books. I felt like they blended into each other really well. It was really fun to watch Lilac grow up and kind of embody this idea of being the queen. But yet she still didn't want to be the queen. And I just thought that was really cool. But where did your inspiration for these books come from? What kind of prompted this story?
It's so funny because when I wrote my Blue Bloods vampire series, I would do a lot of panels with Stephanie Meyer, who wrote Twilight. And Stephanie would say, that the characters came to her in a dream. And I would sit there and be like, oh my God, sorry, Steph. And I just thought, wow, like how lucky, that your characters came to you in a dream. Like that never happens to me. And this happened to me. This book actually did. So, I take everything back that I was thinking during those panels. These characters did come to me in a dream. I saw them kind of like in the woods, in the bushes, and they were like kind of chasing somebody, and they were also being chased, and, they were really hot. So I was like, oh, I want to know what they're going to be up to. It was a part of that, wanting to discover who they were. I knew that he was some kind of like dangerous assassin, and that she was some kind of, who had the kind of a secret identity, who was trying to hide who she really was because she didn't like who she was. She wanted to be someone else. She wanted to be a dangerous assassin as well. And so it's a little bit of an homage to the fantasy books that I read as a kid, but as I was writing it, I realized, not only do you have to layer the plot, you have to build the world, you have to build the mythology. So fantasy books are a lot harder to write than contemporary because of all of that. And every time I write a fantasy novel, I tell my family, remember, this is the last time. I don't want to write these books anymore. They're too hard. And they're like, oh, you always say that.
Say that, and then you end up writing another one, right?
Always.
Well, I did notice that you, in these books, both of them, you really did bring the world building into it very naturally. But you also had excerpts from scrolls, different, alternating point of views, like pieces of history that kind of almost prefaced what was about to happen next. Were those hard to write? What was that experience like, writing from that very different perspective?
I had two characters, POVs in the book. So I would write, maybe a couple of pages of Lilac and then a couple of pages of Cal, because I couldn't write, if I was in Cal's head, that was kind of the Cal day, and the next day would be the Lilac day. And the scrolls and the other kind of historical and mythological bits came much later, when, my editor and I kind of looked at the book and said, it kind of needs something. We need to explain some more of the background of the world. And, and as I was writing those parts of the book, I discovered more about Lilac's mother, for instance, and their background. That's something I hadn't even thought about until I had to write those parts of the book.
Awesome. So Tanaz, you approached, or at least it appeared as the reader that you approached the history very, very differently. I felt like the background for your world was told more through stories, through conversation. So what was that like in Hunted by the Sky, to kind of weave history in and world building in that way?
Well, for me, I drew a lot of my inspiration from Indian history, especially 15th and 16th century India, which was like a period of beautiful labyrinthine palaces, court politics and drama, many warring kingdoms that rose and fell, sometimes over a very short period of time, over a few months or so. And what I was thinking as I was writing was that I wanted to write a story which centered Indian women a lot, because for the longest time I've always seen that Indian women have to be depicted in a certain way for them to be considered quote unquote good women. And so when I looked back into history, I found so many women who were taking part in wars, and they were leaders and they had political ambition, and these were relegated to footnotes in history. And so that's what I was really thinking of. And I was also very much inspired by modern day Indian women, such as the Gulabi Gang. So this is basically now a welfare organization in India, but it had vigilante roots. So women with these gulabi or rose-colored saris would go from village to village with sticks in their hands and protect other women who were being abused by their in-laws or by their husbands. And that's how the Sisterhood of the Golden Lotus came into being. So that was like the starting point for this fantasy. And then I started deep diving into medieval Indian history. And there were the Mughals and the Rajputs and the Marathas, and all of these things were happening. But at the same time, India, as we know, was colonized by the British. So oftentimes the history is told through that lens of colonization. And I had to work on decolonizing my imagination to figure out how my fantasy kingdom of Amber would be similar to, yet different from, a typical kingdom in 15th century India. And I had to focus on the role of women, as I mentioned. I was also focusing on society and culture. One example I can give you is that as recently as 2018, India just decriminalized homosexuality. That was a part of the Indian Criminal Code. But if you look back into medieval history, you'll find so many examples of men professing their love for other men through poetry. And so I thought to myself, yeah, it seems perfectly natural that in my kingdom of Amber, it would be very open to love, and they would even cement this by celebrating annually a festival honoring two gay goddesses. So it was the sort of thing that I kind of interwove into my world as I was doing, and I didn't really think too much about it, because honestly, when I write, I don't think about structuring. I'm a part plotter, but I'm also partly a pantser. And in case the audience doesn't know, this is an author that outlines or by the seat of their pants. So yeah, that's what happens in my writing process. I don't really think too much about it. I just read all these things and I digest them, and somehow it gets mixed up with my own imagination and comes out.
Awesome. Melissa, what does your writing process look like now that Tanaz has kind of brought that up?
Yeah, I like to think about my books for a really long time. So some books, like I'll have the idea for like years and years, and it'll be something that I talk about, and kind of bore my husband with, and he's like, just write it already, and usually I like to think about it for a long time before I put anything to paper, before I write anything on screen. And once I do that, it's kind of a little bit formed in my head. Like I know what the ending is. I know, what the characters are, what the story's about. So I write, maybe like a 5-page, synopsis. And then I write a really detailed chapter by chapter outline, which usually is about maybe 20, 30 pages. And then from there, I write the first 100 pages of my first draft. And then I look at my outline and I look at my draft, and I decide whether the outline is still viable or if the story has taken on this whole different direction and I should change my outline. So it's kind of a lot of planning, but also very organic. Like I don't write just the outline all the way through. I always kind of look to see whether the story is coming alive in a way. But because I have outlined it, I can then kind of tweak and change the outline. So I work very fast in that way. I can write a first draft really quickly. And then it just depends on how many drafts it takes to get it right. And sometimes that happens. Usually my editors tell me, by the second or third revise, the things are really clicking and the characters are coming alive. They're always kind of worried. They're like, it's still kind of flat. I'm like, don't worry, the magic will happen. And that probably takes about, about 6 months all in all to about a year, depending on how hard the book is.
Fair enough. Did you guys plan? So both of your books are duologies, which is really, really cool. Did you guys plan for them to be 2 books, or did that just kind of happen as you started writing? Melissa, what did that look like for Queen's Assassin and the Queen's Secret?
I actually wanted to write 3 books, and it was funny because at the end of the second book, I'm like, really? Like, I have to end it now? And she's like, yes. She was like, I told you, you can do 2. I was like, fine. So I really, really wanted to do this one other story, and I'll probably have to figure out how to do it in a new book if I can't do it in the series. You authors can plan as much as they can, and it just depends on whether there's an audience for it and whether the publisher is willing to risk on it. I published a 7-book series called Blue Bloods, and they bought them 2 by 2. And they actually brought 9, which is funny at the end. And I actually wrapped it up in 7. I said, you know what, actually, I don't need those other 2 books. So we changed it to something else. So it's a conversation. It's, gauging how much of the story is left and how much of the contract you have left as well.
Fair enough. Tanaz, what about you? Was Hunted by the Sky supposed to be 2 books, or did that kind of just happen?
It was supposed to be a trilogy, but yeah, the publisher bought it as a duology, and so I had to suddenly shrink my idea. I had this whole idea of all these characters going through all these different kingdoms. I'm like, nope, shrink. So it's like, you have to suddenly shrink your entire idea down. And in a way, it was okay for me because it allowed me to really expand my existing kingdom itself and sort of play around with the magic and all the existing characters a little bit more. And so I didn't mind it so much. Now, though, and then at the end of it, my editor is like, oh, you can do a spin-off with this character. And I was like, maybe I'll come back to that later. I don't know why. I somehow, when I'm done with a particular world or a series, sometimes I really feel like going back into it, but most times I really don't. I'm like, okay, let them live their life. I've given them a good life most of the time. Not always. But yeah, so, I'm done at the end and then move on to the next project.
Fair enough. So your second book, you said, was coming out in June 22nd, for everybody who's putting this on their list of books to read. But I Melissa, I did read both of these books, and I loved the way it ended. And I felt like it wrapped it up so well. Like all of my questions were answered, but yet there was still enough curiosity for me to be like, I wonder what's going to happen next. So I really loved that it was in this 2-book deal. And Tanaz, I can see definitely how you're going to start the next one, and I was very excited to know that there was another book coming for that. So can't wait to get my hands on that in June 22nd, everyone. So, okay, that's great. And you guys have both mentioned in kind of different ways, but this strong female character, the strong female lead. And you guys really pulled that off really, really well. What I loved is how different your approach was to it. So the Queen's Assassin, the Queen's Secret, I was reading it. I wanted to attend all these balls and be the assassin's apprentice and, be sneaky and have my own little plot. And Hunted by the Sky really made me very hungry. It had so much like Indian culture and all the food that you described and all of that stuff. It made me very hungry. I wanted to walk the markets with these characters. So I loved reading both of these. So that was very enjoyable, and thank you guys for putting that out there in the world for us. I was wondering, I don't know how many writers we have in our audience, but I wanted to know if you guys had any kind of reading or writing suggestions for, the teens and the adults out there, or anybody out there who is looking to kind of enter that world themselves.
Sorry, to enter the fantasy
The writing world, fantasy world, yeah.
For the writing world, what I found, and this is for writers who want to be published, what I used to get published was a book called The Writer's Market, and I believe it is now online because I wanted to be a writer. I didn't know how that would happen, and I thought, oh, there's books. I can read books, and in books there's information and instructions. And the Writer's Market is a list of all the agents and publishers and the kind of books that they publish and the kind of writers they publish. And there are instructions on how to query agents. And that's what I did. I queried about 25 agents. About 6 of them got back to me. And 3 of them offered to represent me. And I picked one of them. And that's kind of how I got my foot in the door. So without knowing anybody, without knowing how this industry works or how to go about that, I bought a book and it sent me on my way.
Awesome. Tanaz, what about you? How can young writers or any writers kind of break into that world?
Well, I was also querying. I queried a lot. I can tell you I sent out about 172 queries before I signed on with my agent. My agent was the 72nd person who basically offered for my book, and I signed on with her. But I would say that the Writer's Market is a good resource. Other resources include agentquery.com, Query Tracker, I think, is another one. There is also Query Shark. I believe that's an online blog where a former literary agent would anonymously critique query letters. So she would tell you exactly what was wrong with your letter, and that is something that I read a lot back when I was querying. What else is there? Absolute Right has tons of forums where lots of other aspiring writers are also querying, or they're giving you tips and stuff like that. So it's a nice little community over there, so you can form a critique group if you like, because that's really helpful. You need someone else who is also trying to pursue writing professionally and find some really good voices who will tell you that something is wrong with your manuscript before you start submitting it to agents, because you need to have a really polished manuscript before you start querying and submitting stuff.
Okay, awesome. So hopefully those of you watching, hopefully those are some good resources for you guys. I also have a copy of Writer's Market, so I know exactly what you're talking about. It's a little bit overwhelming, so maybe being online is a kind of a good thing. So Rising Like a Storm is coming out soon, but I wanted to know, do you guys have any future projects that you're working on? that you would be willing to share just a little bit of information about, a little bit of a teaser about for your fans. Melissa, what about you? Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Either
sure.
one.
No, go ahead, Melissa.
Attendees or something. I keep hearing like a doorbell ringing. So I'm worried. My next book coming out is High School Musical, the musical, the series, the road trip, the novel, which is a bridge novel between season 1 and season 2 of the new High School Musical, the series, which is fun on Disney Plus. So that was a lot of fun, and I got a lot of props from my teen who said, "You're doing that book? What?" So that comes out May 4th. And I have Never After 2, which is the sequel to my middle grade fantasy series, coming out this December as well. And I'm also working on a bunch of new projects. One of the things I can talk about is Blue Bloods, The Return. So there's a new Blue Bloods duology coming out starting in July 2022. And that's been really fun. It's been really fun talking to my fans about it too, because they're so excited.
Awesome. Tanaz, what about you?
Well, I'm working on something new, which I can't really talk much about, but it's going to be an expansion of this universe that I created with the Wrath of Umber series. So it's going to be an expansion, different kingdom, different characters, but I'm having a lot of fun with it.
Awesome. So we do have one question in the chat so far, and it's a two-part question, but the first part was, how do you go about making other languages and cultures accessible for a wider audience? And then part 2 was, where do you draw the line between accessibility and authenticity? Tanaz, do you want to speak to that first?
Sure. So in terms of incorporating other languages and cultures into a book, I would say that when you first start writing the book itself, don't think too much about who's going to be reading it. Just write naturally. And then when you're editing, that's when you start thinking about whether or not you need to trim certain things down, or you need to think about whether or not you need that word there. Because as writers, we're always thinking about which words need to be there in a sentence or anything at all, what chapters need to be there, etc. So when you're putting in foreign language or into a book, I don't like it when authors auto-translate. So I'm not going to write down naan bread. I'm going to write down naan, I'm going to write down dal, and then I'm going to write certain things or give you little hints to see if you can figure out from the context whether or not you know that one is bread and one is lentils, right? That's what I'm going to do. And that's something that you should not be afraid of doing as an author if you're putting in foreign language into your book. You should not be afraid of that. And you can always provide a glossary at the back, because that's what I do. I like to have that, sort of ability for an audience who really wants to learn to be able to go back and read and see, oh, okay, that's what that means, if they don't understand it from the context. But I don't think you should feel afraid, or you should feel like you need to, quote unquote, dumb yourself down for an audience who may not understand. Because I think, to be very honest, our audiences, our readers are very smart. They figure things out by cues and by context and by little hints that you give them. And it's a lot more fun, because honestly, as a teen reader, I know I could not understand so many English words, and I had to figure out what that meant. I didn't even have a dictionary, and that was like literally one of the tests that they gave us in exams. They would not tell us what that word meant, and we had to sort of figure out what the meaning was, and things like that. So I think you can always maintain that sense of authenticity by being true to yourself and by, just describing your culture as it is. You don't need to exoticize it for anyone. You don't need to beautify it for anyone if necessary. But at the same time, you don't also need to delve into certain things or to force yourself, if you're coming from the East, to see from a Western gaze, or force yourself to write from that gaze, because you are writing from your perspective. So don't be afraid of sharing your truth.
Awesome. Melissa, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I know, I just love what you said. I am writing my first picture book, and it is based on, Filipino mythology. And it's about a little old lady who eats all the leftovers. I won't spoil it, But and so, you know, like Tanaz, I had to put all the food in, and I didn't want to explain what it was. I just wanted to say, you know, this is giniling, this is, you know, because there's a lot of Filipino food in it, and it was just really fun to just do that and not feel, you know, that gaze. You know, I grew up in the Philippines, which was a Spanish and then an American colony, and you know, you just realize you internalize so much of that colonial mindset, and so much of writing, you know, because you were reading, you know, books that, you know, written by Americans, you know, that tend to look at, you know, other cultures in that way as other, but we're not other. That's just, you know, what we eat for dinner. And so just presenting it in that way was really, really fun to do.
I love that both of you guys talked about this idea of truth, you know, and not giving so much information, but, you know, letting your readers just kind of explore it on their own. And I think there's a lot of beauty in that because, I mean, after reading both of these novels, I mean, there were cultural things, you know, that got referenced, and I'm like, wait, I don't know about that. But it was just fun to kind of explore it as the characters are exploring too. So that, I mean, that was a great question to ask. I wanted to kind of jump back a little bit to the world building. So when you guys were creating these worlds, both of your series have maps. What was that like? Did that kind of come to you in your own mind? Did someone else draw it for you? Kind of, we see a lot of fantasy novels with maps in them. It's one of my favorite things. So I was really excited to see it in both of your books. But what was the, you know, world building, map drawing? What did that kind of look like? Melissa, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yes, they asked me for a map, and I said, oh, I'm terrible with geography and directions. So, so I said, okay. So I think I had my assistant help me with it, and we, you know, kind of did this very crude, kind of ugly map that then they then gave to the beautiful illustrator who made this beautiful map. And you know, and then we kind of had to figure out where things were from reading the book. Like we said, well, you said it's north, so it can't be here. We got to move that up there, and we got to move that down here. And, you know, as you said, this is a kingdom, but this is a duchy, you know. So it's just a lot of detail. You know, and it is a lot of thinking about the world, you know, in a way that makes it real, you know, and also how long does it travel from this place to that place if they're on horseback, you know, because again, we're in fantasy bookland, which is the hardest book to write. So,
Naz, what about you?
So for me, it's a funny story. I started drawing this map very shortly after I started writing the book itself, and I drew the whole empire's map, and that was like all the 4 kingdoms plus 2 other countries. And so that was very early on, and my map was pretty detailed from the very beginning. And then when I was told we sold the book as a duology and now you have to focus on 1 kingdom, I had to, okay, start working on it. And then I started drawing this map out, and I sent a rough draft to the illustrator because there was a map illustrator as well who did a beautiful job with the whole thing. And then she asked questions that, you know, what about this empty space? What do you want to put there? And I had to start thinking, oh my God, what do I put there really? I'm not that detailed yet in this world. But then I suddenly started putting these places in. And I said, you know what? Let me just start doing it, because I was writing the second book as I was, you know, doing edits and dealing with these questions. And I said, you know what? I think I can work these places into the second book as well. So it's sort of, you know, it was like a very collaborative effort. Sometimes someone will make a suggestion to me, and then it will somehow make its way into the story, even though there was no intention for it to be there. Like another funny story, the cover, the girl has a nose ring, the model. So I didn't initially have my character have a nose ring, but I said, oh, that's cool. Let me put that into the book. So, you know, those are the kinds of things that happen when you're writing. It just comes out of nowhere sometimes.
Awesome. So I was just thinking, Tanaz, you talked a lot about kind of incorporating the medieval Indian, you know, that whole culture, that whole time period. But you guys have both talked about implementing mythology. So did you kind of focus on, and Tanaz, did you focus on like Indian mythology, Melissa, what mythology did you focus on? You guys have mentioned it a few times, and I know that that can really have a big influence on fantasy genre in general. But Tanaz, what do you think? How did
Well,
that mythology
definitely.
kind of fit into it? Sorry.
So definitely, in terms of mythology, I was definitely influenced by Indian and Persian mythology, because Persia also had a huge influence on medieval Indian culture, and also because I am Zoroastrian, so my ancestors are Persian, so they came to India as refugees many years ago, and so I definitely wanted there to be some Persian influence in the books, and I took a lot of certain characters or certain creatures in the series called the Pashu, so they're part human, part animal beings, and they were definitely inspired by Indian and Persian mythology, so it's both Hindu and Zoroastrian mythology. And in terms of the mythology itself, what I really wanted to do was also create my own myths, because the thing with Indian fantasy fiction in general is that a lot of it is really based on retellings of mythology, and it has been done so many times. I wanted to do something a little bit different. So I was taking a strong basis in mythology, but at the same time, I was creating my own myths, such as the myth of the two moon goddesses and things like that. So yeah, that's how I played with it.
Awesome. Melissa, what did that look like in your duology?
It was definitely based on Western fantasy. So, I wanted to have some wizards and some, kind of more, kind of like of that fantasy genre. They weren't quite elven. It wasn't quite based on anything, specific, I should say. And one of the funny things that happened when I was doing it was there's a chapter where she encounters a creature, and in my draft, the creature was a jaguar. And my copy editor, who has copied many of my books, Anne said, it kind of seems like they're in, kind of Europe. So there are no jaguars in Europe. Should we change it to an animal that's found in Europe? And I said, well, but it's not in Europe. It's, in Renovia, which is a made-up fantasy country. And so in my country, there are jaguars, and I want to keep my jaguar. So, because it's made up and because, it only exists in my head, that's the beauty of writing, fiction and fantasy, is that, you create these worlds. They're not, Renovia is not Italy, they're and not Spain. Maybe they're inspired by, that, those countries, but they are not. They come from my head.
Right, exactly. That's the best place for the stories to come from. The Jaguar, I'm glad you brought that up. That was such a almost like terrifying moment in the book for the reader, because it's just shrouded in this darkness, and then you just have this beast that just appears. But it was just so steeped in magic at that point, and it was really scary. It was a little bit scary, but in the best of ways. In the best of ways. So both of your books also have a lot of elements of kind of regency. So how did you go about creating the structure of the kingdom itself? Was that more based on history, based on what we've seen in history and the cultures that you guys were able to bring in, or did you try to incorporate more of your own imagination for that? Melissa, do you want to start?
Yeah, I've done a lot of research on kind of court life, in kind of the kind of 1700s. So it was a little bit based on that, about etiquette and things that I kind of already knew from writing other books. So I did I did a little research, I kind of dabbled in that kind of stuff. You want it to feel as authentic as possible. So I think research definitely is necessary, but then you don't want to be bound to that. You don't, you're not restricted by it because you are writing fantasy. But I do think it's different if you're using kind of known mythologies, like Hindu mythology or, Native American mythology. I think it's much, much, much more important to really know that before you change things around, because it's not something that people are so familiar with, so they won't know what's authentic and what you made up, whereas I think, we're also, we pretty much know, kind of the Western history a little well, so people kind of know that, and then I can play with it a lot more.
Awesome. What about you, Tanaz? How did you kind of create this court life, this hierarchy of power in your books?
Well, one thing I knew going in is that I was looking at India as a country as well, and in terms of culture and things like that. So I knew going in that their power in this society would be based on magics, and there would be two classes, the magi versus the non-magi, people who have magic and people who don't. And basically the magi were in the majority, and that they were oppressing the non-magi, and they were segregating them into these tenements. So a lot of it what had to do with was a sort of throwback on the caste system in general, and also the way untouchability was dealt with. So it was kind of like an allusion to that. So careful readers who are familiar with Indian culture will realize that at once. In terms of the court life, I was definitely inspired by the Mughals and the Rajputs. So if you know about the Taj Mahal, who built it, it was a Mughal emperor who built it, Shah Jahan, and his grandfather Akbar. He was the one whose historical period I was most inspired by in terms of the courtly life and how the palaces were built and things like that. And also the state of Rajasthan has beautiful palaces. So in terms of that, the courtly life, I was definitely taking inspiration from places that already existed. And in terms of the power structure and hierarchies, I read a lot of historical nonfiction by authors like William Dalrymple, Ira Mukoti, Ruby Lal, and I was taking as much as I could from those sources while writing these books. At the same time, also, I was looking at Bollywood movies for all the splendor and the grandeur, because it's so much fun to just have that visual effect in there. And I was telling someone recently that yes, I do know these movies are not historically accurate, but they're really, really great if you want the visuals and you want the stunning impact in your head while you're writing.
I think I can definitely see how that might have played an influence in just the color. Like there was so much color reference in Hunted by the Sky, with the saris and the different royal attire. It was just very vibrant all the time. Whereas the Queen's Secret, there was a lot of purple. This typically royal color that kind of just elevated the characters a little bit. I just loved the role of color for those characters. So those of you watching, please feel free to put any questions you have for our authors in the chat box, and we'll make sure that we answer them. We have about 12 minutes left, so we want to make sure that you guys have time to ask them anything that you have. I have just a couple more questions, but I want to just make sure that you guys all get your questions in there as well. Okay, so one more for now. One more question is, what other books would you guys recommend for readers? It could be your own, but also like, how can other readers just kind of branch out into fantasy, or any other books that were really influential for you?
So in terms of fantasy, anything by N.K. Jemisin is really, really great. Really great books and really imaginative fantasy worlds. If you like Hunted by the Sky and you like Indian fantasy, definitely check out Tasha Suri's books, Empire of Sand. Then there's Swati Tirthala's Tiger at Midnight series, which is also ancient India inspired. And those are some good books to begin with.
Beautiful.
I love, and it was called the Anti-Harry Potter book when it came out. Is a friend of mine, Kathleen Dewey, who sadly passed away and didn't finish the series. But you have to read the two books in Skin Hunger. They're very, very dark, and they're kids' books, but they're kind of horrifying and really, really original and scary and amazing. So I would like to plug Kathleen's books. They're very, very inspiring, and I love the way she talks about magic in it. and yeah, pick them up. Skin Hunger.
Beautiful. I actually haven't read any of those, so I get to add them all to my list as well, which is great. You know, I get to expand my own writing a little bit. Okay, so you guys, one more thing I was just thinking of is that you guys both had a very strong female character. You know, a lot of power, a lot of coming into their own power. And you guys have kind of talked about how, you know, that was a focus for you, but you also have supporting male characters who are also kind of powerful, who really, you know, support our female heroine in their endeavors. What was it like to write about Cal and Kavas, and, you know, how did you create their support for our main heroines? Melissa, do you mind talking about Cal a little bit?
Oh, Cal, I love all my heroes. I think we have to fall in love. I mean, if I don't fall in love with them, how do I expect my readers fall in love with them? And I think you have to write them, you know, just as vulnerable and just as human as the female protagonists. But you know, one thing that I always kind of try to resist is making either of my characters very perfect. You know, you don't want them to be so likable that they're saccharine, and you don't want the male to be so, I mean, sometimes I'll read books and I'll be like, there's no guy who would do this, you know. I don't want to set up, like, you know, let's say unreal expectations for the girls who are reading these books. So, you know, and one thing that I tell my teen a lot is that, you know, the boys are just as insecure and just as, you know, human as you, and just as nervous, and you know, they're not these like mysterious brooding creatures that, you know, we put so much on. You know, they actually are people, and to kind of see them as people, and as, you know, as equals in that way. And so I like to, you know, and you know, I have to say, I think because I've been married now for, we've been together for 25 years. I think we've been married for 18. I'm not sure. It's close to 20. So, you know, I want to write about, and my parents had a wonderful marriage. So I think I write about really supportive relationships. You know, I want to write about, you know, not just happy relationships, but supportive, you know, what, you know, and just right now, Prince Philip has died, and he was the man who walked two places behind his wife. You know, how did that, you know, and he was this alpha male, you know, very macho guy, but he supported her, and he was her rock, and, you know, and they figured out a way to make it work between themselves with the duty that they had to do in the personal life that, you know, you have to find happiness in. So I think writing male characters, you know, as these kind of flawed but amazing, you know, and swoony people is very important if you're writing YA.
One of my sorry, Tanaz, before I ask you the same question, one of the things I really loved about Cal in The Queen's Assassin, when he first meets Lilac, is just how frustrated he was with her. Like, he didn't want her around. He wanted her to go. He didn't want to train her, and he was confused, but yet he's like, okay, well, I guess you're here. It's fine. But I just thought that was very comical because it just seemed so accurate, and you know, I loved it. That was a really fun part, and I think it really helped us get to know Cal and his role in the book. Okay, so what about Kavas? Tanaz, what was it like for him?
Well, with Kavas, the thing with his character was that so basically Gul is a magus, and she's from the Magi majority of the kingdom, and she has magical powers. Kavas lives in the tenements, and he doesn't have magic. So his perspective was, first of all, very important to bring in because he comes from a place that is not of privilege. So his perspective and his ideology was important to bring in. I just didn't want Gul to be the main character telling the whole story. I wanted his point of view to be there. And at the same time, you know, his relationship with Gul is one of almost instant chemistry and almost instant antagonism. So it's like, there's this like, they're like sparking off when they're meeting from the very beginning. And it's like, it was just fun to write, that very first scene when they meet at the Moon Festival, it was just something that just, it just established their relationship off the bat. Okay, this is what it's going to be. It's going to be antagonistic, and there are also going to be some really hot kisses in there. So we knew how it was going to go. But at the same time, I think for them, their relationship is one of, it's more of a reluctant alliance. So it's like they're discovering each other as they go along. They both have flaws, and they're both really messy at times. But that's the fun in writing them, because they're both sort of growing together. And they're both sort of also learning to trust each other in different ways, because they both come from very different elements of society. And so there's a natural and inherent distrust there. But that's, I think, the fun of writing these particular relationships for me. I'm a sucker for enemies to lovers. So that's my kind of thing. I really enjoy that. And I love it, especially when you're going through the book. And it's not a quick fix. So it's not like, halfway through, okay, everything is fine. No, that antagonism sort of continues throughout. And you have to really bring a proper resolution to it.
Yeah, I liked him just as much as I liked Cal. He was just he was almost like brooding and had this really this conflicting opinion of what to do about her, but no, I've got to take care of everything else going on. But yes, they were immediately attracted to each other, and I was rooting for them the whole time. But then they weren't talking, so I completely agree. I was rooting for them, and yeah, I was like, okay, they got to learn to trust each other, talk to each other a little bit. So I loved both of those characters. I felt like they really supported our female characters so strongly. And it was great that they were along for the ride and that we got to see their perspective as well. We are running out of time. Is there anything that you ladies would like to throw out there? Anything that you want to say about your books?
Okay, I'll go first. I would like to first of all thank everyone at the San Antonio Book Festival for inviting us to this festival. It was really fun talking to you, Amanda, and you, Melissa, and I hope the attendees also enjoyed. And I just wanted to mention that both of my books, Hunted by the Sky and Rising Like a Storm, have a pre-order campaign going on right now. So you can get some pretty cool swag if you pre-order these books, and the paperback for this one and the hardback or any other version that's available in your country for Rising. And you'll get some amazing swag, and you can also get some signed copies from my local indies. And all of that information can be found on my website, tanazbhathena.com, or on my Instagram at Bhathena.
I will be back here at 1:30 with Melissa Albert talking about fairy tales. So come and see me and Melissa. And yeah, High School Musical, the musical, the series, the road trip, the novel is out May 4th.
I love it. That's a long mouthful of a title, but I love it. Awesome. So those of you watching, don't forget that you can buy these wonderful books at Nowhere Bookshop in San Antonio, and online. They are so great. They were so fun to read, really enjoyable characters, really great world. And it was a pleasure to talk with you ladies, a pleasure to get to meet you today. So thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Bye.